psych friends in here, so. Okay. Well, I'll tell you guys what it is. The hedonic adaptation was a theory that was brought out by two researchers back in the 70s. And essentially what it is, it's that this is the tendency for people to become accustomed to positive experiences over time. And when you get accustomed to positive experiences over time, you tend to appreciate them less. So what once might have felt really exciting, like your partner being able to look at you with that really sweet look in their face, maybe 10 years later, that look in their face, you might want to on his face for a little bit of doing that potentially, right? Not to be like that, right? But it's what ends up being extraordinary starts to feel normal and not as exciting. And a couple of research studies were done on hedonic adaptation, noticing, and this was back in 2012, that noticed that marital satisfaction declines in the first 5 years of marriage, particularly because partners stop being actively engaged in the same ways they were in the beginning due to this hedonic adaptation, right? The same thing that we were looking for initially in early marriage, where we really focus on the strengths, they're not as exciting. The strength that I once saw in my spouse doesn't feel like a strength all the time because now the kids are getting in the way and I have to do this and my job changed, and we tend to focus more on frustrations and flaws. So hedonic adaptation is one way in which sometimes we will focus on another person's imperfection. The second one is the negativity bias. Also maybe something you guys have heard of before. It's a very common notion. So this is the tendency for humans to give more weight to negative experiences, emotions, or information than the positive ones, right? So it almost goes hand in hand with hedonic adaptation. This bias is actually, though, really rooted in evolution. This was a really necessary thing for us as human beings to have when we were back in the day with our survival mechanism, because we needed this. People had to prioritize these negative experiences because they were often linked to active threats, right? Like that moment that you were being chased by a tiger was a real moment that you had to internalize and clock in your mind as this is really important because I almost died, right? It was connected to your survival. So this mechanism, when it became encoded, it starts to influence your perception of future behavior. However, along the way, this once very effective feature of our mind has become ineffective when adapting to our modern day world, right? I can no longer assume on a day-to-day basis that I'm going to inevitably be chased by a tiger. So I have to look out for every moment of my day for something bad that's going to happen to me. How this has happened and how we've adapted it to our relationships is what we've also seen from research is like negative events that are seemingly small in our relationship, things like criticism, rejection, stress, these end up having a greater psychological impact than the positive ones over time because we're more likely to see it. And the more likely you are to see it, and there's no counterbalance because of also your hedonic adaptation by remembering all the good, positive things about your spouse, this over time can manifest in disconnection, emotional distance. So there was a questionnaire done in a study of 2001 excuse me, that they did ask a bunch of, maybe I think it was a study of about 2,000 couples, if I'm not mistaken, and they asked them specifically questions about marital satisfaction, but around certain aspects of being critical and certain aspects of being positive, and the way that they would assess their partner, right? Like, I'm more likely to say that my partner is a good spouse, like questions like that, versus I'm more likely to say that my spouse is not meeting my needs. And the more likely that they were to answer the negative bias ones, the more likely they were to, in the next 5 years, end up divorced. So we do know the negativity bias does yield to, when focused on that as your partner as a whole, tends to be leading you down the path of separation. So this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about attachment theory again. So our pasts do shape our perception. I want to remind you guys, for those who maybe didn't get a chance to, I get to see you guys last time, was attachment theory is done by this psychologist called John Bowlby, and back in the 60s. He essentially formulated that your early experiences with caregivers will absolutely set the foundation for how you're going to live in the rest of the world, how you're going to operate in your relationships, how you're going to see each other in these relationships, not only friendships, but your romantic relationships as well, and how you're going to react to certain conflicts that come up. So if we had caregivers in your life, if you think about your own, that were critical, if they were inconsistent, if they maybe were emotionally distant and they withheld their love from you, you as a whole, from an attachment theory perspective, might be more sensitive to your spouse's imperfections as a form of self-protection. That's kind of a psychological theory, if you will, right? It's so if you look at what is the validity of that, or why would someone do that, it's because, again, it's really hard to look at yourself and face some of the realities and the pain and the hurts of what it would mean if you grew up in a household that was not loving, right? So it might be easier to take your sense of self and just think, I'm not going to look at it, but what I will focus on, what might feel easier to change or to really be upset about, is to redirect it and project it onto my spouse.
Fathers, mothers, or both?
Oh, both. Both. So we know from, I'm not going to get into too much about the attachment styles, but we do know from research, people who have an insecure attachment style, which usually is, as you guys can guess by the name, you are not secure in your relationships. They tend to perceive their partners more negatively and assume the worst about their behaviors than people who are securely attached, right? So, this is important because it actually becomes a self-fulfilling cycle, right? The more that you perceive those flaws, the more that you might feel like you want to step away from your partner or hone in and really go at it on your partner, or vice versa. You might, if you're avoidant, you might see your partner's flaws and you might feel like they're aware of my flaws and I'm just going to back away and not give them the opportunity to critique me or criticize me more than they are. So this is an opportunity just to take a minute to think, if you're someone maybe who grew up with critical parents, maybe take a second to be reflective of you might be hypersensitive to your spouse's minor mistakes, right? They forgot to take out the garbage in the 10 minutes that you asked them to do it. Are you finding yourself pondering and thinking about that over and over? Like, why didn't they do it? It would take 3 seconds, whatever it might be. If you had maybe inconsistent caregivers, you may fear rejection. You may be over-analytical to certain imperfections. Do we have any questions so far? And this is heavy on the educational side, so please stop me if you guys want me to slow down here. So let's talk about expectations. I am a firm believer that expectations can be very healthy, and on the same boat, it's an incredible dyad. It can be incredibly destructive based on what those expectations are. The comparison trap, this is both part of expectations. Let me talk about expectations first. From a psychological perspective, something called social exchange theory, we understand that when we enter into a relationship, we all maybe have certain expectations about how we want our relationship to go, really rooted in rewards and costs, right? So when one partner's expectations for rewards like affection, support, validation are not met, they may perceive the relationship as unbalanced or unfair, right? I feel like I'm not getting something from you. I'm in a deficit on the social exchange theory. This leads to dissatisfaction and conflict, right? If you are in understanding of this theory with your expectations, the more you're comparing your partner, and then in general in the comparison trap, you're comparing your partner to these idealized standards from social media, from your fellow people at church, from anything that you're seeing around you. This is also going to lead you right to disappointment and increased focus on those imperfections. Either way, we know from research that social media is slowly becoming a terrible, sometimes really not helpful piece of our humanity, but it really does increase overarchingly. Most research now has absolutely proven this. It will reduce your sense of connection to your partner by making real relationships seem less satisfying. Real relationships, the ones that do deal with actual conflict that you're able to get through, versus these hyper idealized, everything is perfect, you have 3 kids and you're wealthy and you live the most perfect life. Comparing yourself to that will automatically put yourself in the light to compare yourself on that social exchange ladder. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's a great question. So that is a conversation between you and your ego to decide. Is it possible for you to lower your expectations and still find satiety in your everyday life? Yes, absolutely. That is something, though, that if you find yourself saying, I should lower my expectations, but if it's yielding to a pushback internally from you thinking, and your ego's telling you, well, now you're just settling and you deserve more than that, and da-da-da-da-da, then lowering your expectations may not be for you just yet. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So how does this apply to relationship? I really want you guys to consider checking in with yourselves a lot about how much maybe time you might spend on social media, but in general, looking at all of these things combined, checking in about your human condition, but the way that you're evaluating your spouse as a human as well, right? If we can hold the grace and acceptance that our spouse, for one, is also a human, ideally, we're going to talk about what does acceptance mean in this, but it's recognizing we are more often than not going to look at our partner and see over time the fading of our positive experiences with them, That's naturally going to happen. We are over time, every day, going to notice ourselves increase in taking on the negativity bias by tending to focus in more on our partner's perceived flaws or the things that we think they're doing wrong. We are over time going to understand that our past, especially if gone unaddressed, is going to impact the way that we connect with our partners in our relationship, because our own stuff, our own baggage is getting in the way of us getting to actually give true grace and credence to the way our partners actually may be showing up for us in the right ways. And then finally, these expectations can plant a narrative and a seed that this person's not good enough, they're not doing the things you want, you're actually really unhappy, whatever it might be. Okay, questions? Are we okay so far? Okay. I'm going to briefly mention this because I feel like this is an overdone topic on what is a godly marriage, but I'm going to just quickly cover it. In the Coptic tradition, a godly marriage, as we know, is the sacrament of marriage, right? Where it's supposed to mirror the love and unity between Christ and the church, right? We've all heard that 10,000 to 15,000 times. I hope so. It's built on love. It's built on respect. It's built on sacrifice and prayer, right? The teachings of the church fathers and the wisdom we learn from scripture, they really guide couples living out the sacred covenant in a healthy way, emphasizing mutual love, emphasizing fidelity, forgiveness, and humility, and then overarchingly for the goal of nurturing children in the family setting, right? So godly marriage ultimately is a path to holiness and salvation, and we know that, and it's supposed to help spouses grow closer to God and each other, right? And reflect his love to the world. So what is it? It's one where we honor that we are created to be together to fill one another. I was watching a sermon by, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. I want to say his name is Abuna Paul from the St. Paul Church, but that doesn't sound right. So it's Abuna something from St. Paul Church in Washington, D.C. I will definitely, if you guys want this link, I'll send it to you. It's a great sermon on what is a godly marriage, and I watched it, and he brought up a really interesting point that when you guys look in the Bible in Genesis 2:18, how many things did God say, I made this and it was good? It's a Bible question for you guys. Tony? Yeah. Huh? He only said this is good about man? That would be great. That'd be really great if he did. A few more things though, Tony. Yeah, he said, and then God created the heavens and the earth. He saw it was good, right? And so it was like 7 days across 7 times. The first time in the Bible, in Genesis, that God said something wasn't good was this verse. And the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. This is the very first thing that God said in the entire world was not good, was for a man to be alone. So we are actually made to be created together to fulfill one another, right? I will make a helper comparable to him. Okay? Second thing that a godly marriage is, it's one that honors that when we are together, we are better, we support one another, and with the ultimate goal of salvation, right? And so we know from Ecclesiastes chapter 4, the verse says, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? This verse applies to other relationships, not just in marriage. But the goal is that marriage is the most intimate of human experiences, right? God created it to help one another, to comfort one another, and support one another. We really were never meant to be alone. And I also want to point out, none of that verse says like, for if they fall, one will lift up his companion. It doesn't say, for if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but first pointing out all the things for the reasons that they fell down. It's not like the verse says that, right? It just says we'll lift each other up. Thank you. I aim to please. Okay. Oh. Thank you. I'm happy to support the men. Okay, let's talk about sacrifice. So a godly marriage is one that is expressed through sacrifice, asking us to live up to the responsibilities given to us by God. So if you guys really think about it, marriage for sure, as a psychologist, I'll tell you, marriage is really hard, right? But there are certain responsibilities that equally, when we agreed in a conscious, sound of mind thought, we all agreed to this covenant, it came with certain other responsibilities. In the marriage aspect, a godly marriage is demonstrated through sacrifice, right? I really love this this line from St. John Chrysostom, he spoke about the importance of mutual service in marriage by saying the husband should give himself up for his wife just as Christ did for the church, and the wife should respect her husband in the same way church does Christ, right? I really appreciate he said that, because I know we have a lot of folks that will look at the covenant that's assigned to us in marriage and will hear those two verses from the Bible in the marriage ceremony heard very differently, right? It's husbands or wives submit to your husbands, and then husbands should love the church. And a lot of times I'll hear this a lot from a lot of women, that we just hear the wives submit to your husband. What's that supposed to mean, right? And it takes on a whole meaning. It's not. The beauty of this is that, and I will talk about this a little bit if we have time, is we are called to mutually submit and sacrifice for one another. This is a responsibility that we were given by God. Again, not one where we are called to critique, criticize, but to sacrifice and love one another. And then the other covenant is to, raise children together, if that's your plan in life. But it is a responsibility that is taught to us by the church and is a part of our sacraments in the church. Finally, and this is arguably, I think, the best one, is where God is the foundation. Matthew 18:20 says, this is a very popular verse, hopefully you guys know it, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with you, right? And so if God is the foundation, God said it plainly to you. When 2 of you are together in your marriage and otherwise, I am also with you. This is a really hopefully powerful and soothing verse to hear, but it's a reminder that a godly marriage is one where the unity of our marriage is inviting God's presence, his acceptance, his blessings, the shout of his protection into your life, right? 1 Corinthians 7:14 reminds us that when blessed by God, the marriage becomes holy, and only then when it's blessed by God, right? So for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. It is together that we become sanctified in our individual self as one union. Okay. Questions about that? No, straightforward. Was just like, sorry guys, I didn't mean to bore you with that one. So it's a good reminder. Thank you. Okay, I love this one. If I were the devil. This is a really fun one. I will admit, I definitely use social media myself, so I'm not going to be hypocritical and say I never use it. But I found this interesting video that asked on social media to ChatGPT, if I were the devil, how would you break up, if you were the devil, if you were the devil, ChatGPT, how would you break up a godly marriage? And I thought that was really interesting. So I wanted to read to you guys what ChatGPT said. So can I have anyone who has a microphone or feels loud and encouraged to read this top portion?
If I were the devil and wanted to break up a godly marriage, I wouldn't use an obvious, dramatic attack. That would be too easy to resist. Instead, I'd be subtle, patient, and strategic, using small cracks to eventually shatter the foundation. Here's how I'd do it.
Okay. And just, Cook, sorry, can you remind me in the interest of how much time do I do have? Sorry, I just want to make sure I don't want to go over. 30 minutes? Okay. So I can go through these one by one, but if you guys are interested in what ChatGPT said, it was very interesting. Or would we prefer I can move through these quickly? We want to hear what ChatGPT says? Okay. The first one that ChatGPT said was, I would make them focus on themselves instead of each other. I'm going to just read it to you. I'd whisper thoughts like, why should I always be the one to give in? I deserve more appreciation. What about my happiness? I'd make selflessness feel like a burden rather than an act of love. Instead of thinking, how can I serve my spouse? I'd shift their focus to, what am I not getting? The second one, turn communication into a battle. I wouldn't stop them from talking. I'd just make sure they talk less about meaningful things and more about logistics like bills, schedules, or chores. And I'd misinterpret each other's words. I'd encourage them to misinterpret each other's words, turning small disagreements into personal attacks. And finally, I would avoid hard conversations until resentment builds like poison. Slowly, they'd stop feeling heard. And when someone else listens, like a coworker or a friend, they'll finally feel understood in a way that their spouse just doesn't provide anymore. Okay, next one, keep them busy with good things. I wouldn't tempt them with obviously bad distractions. Instead, I'd fill their time with endless scrolling, hobbies, and entertainment. So they spend their time near each other, but not with each other. Little by little, I'd make quality time feel unnecessary, then uncomfortable, and then non-existent. This one, turn small flaws into big resentments. A lot of what we're talking about here today. I'd make sure they focus on their spouse's worst habits rather than their strengths. I would have them focus on the one thing they don't have instead of the blessings they do. Past mistakes and focus on past mistakes, ensuring forgiveness feels impossible. I'd make sure they see their spouse as an obstacle to their happiness instead of their God-given partner. As you can see, Devil ChatGPT had a lot to say. I have two more. Introduce harmless temptations. I would introduce a coworker or online friend who understands them better than their spouse. I would introduce them to social media posts that make them think, why isn't my marriage like that? I wouldn't have to be in fantasies about an easier, more exciting life without their spouse. It wouldn't have to be an affair, just enough emotional distance to make their spouse feel like a burden instead of a gift. Two more. Weaken their faith together. Making prayer together awkward or we're too busy to do. Slowly replace scripture with self-help advice that focuses on what you deserve. Keep them too tired for church so they lose their support system. If I can separate them from God's presence, they'll rely on their own emotions, which are easily manipulated. Last one. Make divorce feel like an only option. When the loneliness, resentment, and disconnection have built up, I'd introduce thoughts like, maybe we were never meant to be together. I love them, but I'm not in love with them. God wants me to be happy, and this marriage isn't making me happy. Once they believe divorce is better than fighting for their marriage, I won. It's incredibly heartbreaking. Tell me more. What are we thinking? Reactions to this? I even read this and I was like, whoa, this felt very real. What was that? He probably does. Let's be honest. He probably does. Interesting, right? I mean, I'm not going to get into this tangent about humans creating chat. Anyway, so hoping what you guys would maybe have also heard from this is everything I just named about how we use our own biases in the hedonic adaptation, negativity bias, our own past influencing our perceptions and comparison expectations. Every single one of those things was covered in what the devil uses to help break up a godly marriage. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I don't know if you're planning to come back ever again.
In life here or to the slide?
No, like you're gonna have a baby and your life is gonna be busy, but we need to hear a talk with 7 points about the opposite.
I really hope I'm going to answer all those today, so I hope so.
Okay.
But I will gladly come back, a baby or not.
I'll stay tuned.
Thank you. Okay, so I did this for emphasis really to also, again, it was very interesting obviously to see this from ChatGPT, but I did this for emphasis because this was a machine producing very human, very, I think, relatable results, right? I can guarantee that every single one of you in this room at one time or another has had a thought exactly like the ones I've read. I know I have in my marriage. This is not an uncommon feeling. It's nothing to be ashamed of. But what I hope we can name together is rather than having it actually be fueled by shame, which may be another layer the devil uses to keep you from actually exploring it or contesting it or thinking about it more thoroughly, he keeps you in a position to think, I should just keep the track I'm going. I should just keep going down all these things on the list and just allow this to happen as is. This is why I want to talk to you guys about it today. So we open up a conversation to take away the stigma of talking about our own flaws. It's okay to have these feelings. It is going to happen. Rather than cursing it as our human condition and imperfection, we actually will talk about embracing it. So I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yes, sir. Yeah. Michael. Nice to meet you, Michael. I'm actually going to hopefully address in these 7 points this exactly right now. So I did have more information on what is what does the church view and psychology as they come together? How does the church and psychology come together to actually talk about what makes a strong marriage? I can talk about that if you guys want, but I'm thinking some of this will get addressed right now. So if you guys want me to go back to that, happy to speak a little bit more to also church fathers and what they say about conflict. Okay, so the first one is something called, this is a tool for your imperfectly perfect union that we're going to talk about, is complaint versus criticism. Has anyone here ever heard of Dr. John Gottman? Yes. Oh, thank God. I love hearing, of course, to that. Dr. Gottman, for those who don't know, and his wife, Dr. Julie Gottman, are two clinical psychologists who spent their entire life focusing just on relationships and what makes relationships successful. They are arguably, I think, one of the biggest pillars in the field of psychology about what, where we've learned about healthy relationships. And Dr. Gottman's together discovered and created something called the 4 pillars of the apocalypse. I'm seeing a lot of head nodding. What those are, for those who don't know, is that they came up with, if one of these 4 things are happening in your relationship, it's of the apocalypse, it suggests your marriage is not going down the great route. There is a good chance that you will end up in separating or divorce. To the point that this was such a successful, such a profound theory that Dr. Gottman would meet with couples. I think he met with and interviewed about 25,000 couples. This was a landmark study back in the 80s or 90s. He interviewed about 25,000 couples in just a clinical interview. He watched them interact together. He asked them questions about how they handle conflict, how they what do they love about each other, questions like that. And he predicted with a 90% success rate, whether in 5 years or not, that couple would get a divorce. Yikes. 90% success rate. A lot of those couples did actually, it was a huge longitudinal study. They followed those couples for about 10 years. Many of them did, in fact, I think, again, with a 90% success, to get divorced. It was very tragic, but we learned a lot. One of the pillars that he does talk about, one of the parts of the pillars of those 4 horsemen, if you will, is something called complaint versus criticism. So this is sometimes hard to differentiate between the two. But when we're talking about noticing our couple and how to react with them, the difference is that a general rule is a criticism is a personal attack or an accusation, whereas a complaint is a negative comment about something that you wish were different otherwise. So another way to put this is that a complaint starts with the word I. I really wish that the garbage was taken out so that I can rest for 5 minutes, right? Whereas a criticism starts with you. You are such an inconsiderate slob for not taking out the trash today. Does that make sense? So I want to show you guys very briefly. That's the wrong computer. Really fast. I'm going to come back to this. Don't look. About this. This is Dr. Gottman and his wife, Dr. Julie Gottman. And I fast forward to the part specifically where they talk about complaint versus criticism. Will the sound work? I hope.
Yeah, and we move on next to how a couple handles conflict. That
That's
turns
a
out to
big
be
one.
very.
That's a big one. So I guess, are we going through all the 7 principles here?
I think we are. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So with conflict management, there are several things that are super, super important. First of all, how do you bring up a problem that is between you in the relationship? How do you bring up a complaint? Well, you don't do it with criticism, by negatively describing your partner, like saying, God, you are such a slob. Why don't you ever clean up the kitchen? Instead, you describe yourself and the situation and then say what your positive need is. So let me break that down a little bit. So by describing your feelings first, it may sound something like this. I'm unhappy, I'm angry, annoyed, I'm sad, I'm nervous. That's step 1, all those feelings. About what? So you're not saying about you and here's how you're bad. That doesn't work. That's criticism. Instead, what you're doing is saying about the situation. The bills haven't been paid yet, and that's making me feel nervous. Hear the difference? You're describing the situation. Or you can say, I walked into the kitchen and I felt really annoyed because there were still dishes in the sink. There you go. That's the situation. And then what is your positive need? And what we mean by a positive need is, how can you shine for me? How can you do something that will make me feel better rather than just expressing, your resentment? So that might sound like, I'm really upset that the kitchen is a mess. Would you please clean it up tonight before dinner? Not so hard, right?
So we call that gentle startup rather than harsh startup, which is pointing your finger at your partner and being critical or even demeaning, belittling your partner, being contemptuous. So gentle startup is a big part of
Softened startup,
making the conflict really much more collaborative that way.
Right. So
I highly recommend you guys watch this video. I can, again, happy to send it to Nicole or Sean or whoever, so you guys can get it. This is a really great video. It is, oh no, that's not what I wanted. Not from the beginning. Okay, good. It is called this. If you guys want to take a picture of it or find it, you easily just Google it. 7 Habits for a Happy Relationship, Lasting Love, John Gottman. It should pop up right away. Okay, so going back. So the idea about what he's, both Gottman said about the complaint versus criticism, as you guys can see, it really, I know that may have sounded to you guys when you heard the complaint versus criticism, sounds really small. It actually sounds like a very small difference, right? That's barely differential between saying, I mean, not obviously as critical as they said it, right? But like, I feel nervous because the trash hasn't been taken out yet versus you haven't done something or you didn't take out the trash yet. However, the point of why this difference is important is because a criticism, when you point a finger and start your sentence with the word you, immediately the brain sees that as the negativity bias, immediately sees that as I have to now be on a defense. My partner is attacking me. They're attacking me in the way that now my brain's telling me I have to go into my defense mode. I have to go into fight or flight. The stress response we talked about for males versus the way that women deal with it. All of this is happening in rapid succession within 3 to 4 milliseconds of your time, which is why this does matter. So speak with love, not with attack, and use the gentle startup method. The second one is gratitude. I'm sure you guys have heard this 1,000 million times, but why does this actually matter? I want you guys to think back to what we just learned about the way that Devil ChatGPT talks about breaking up the marriage. What he will do is that if we already know that the brain does notice more flaws than positive things, focusing on the good builds marital satisfaction over time. So how do you use this? This is going to take work on your part. And I'm telling you guys this, a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the next, like the rest of the slide is me tasking you as an individual. This is not a moment right now. If you're saying you're nudging your spouse and saying, pay attention, you're not getting the point of this. This is for you as an individual. Okay. So this is how do you use gratitude? Catch your partner doing something right. When was the last time that you saw your partner unconsciously do a chore or task that maybe you've asked them to do 1,000 times? And maybe you did catch them. And how many times have they maybe have done that and you guys have not said anything to them? Not just noticing the mistakes, which I imagine every time you clock it and call it out immediately the second you can. This is the opposite. The use of gratitude is helpful here. I even want to encourage you guys, if you struggle with this in the moment, some of us, I struggle with my attention sometimes. So I have learned that maybe it's helpful to keep something called a gratitude journal. Write down at least one thing daily that you appreciate about your partner. Right? One thing. It doesn't have to be extravagant things. It can be anything, but find something. This is an important step because it needs to force your brain to start to rewire itself around just seeing the bad and allowing more of the good to come in. And then at night, every night, I do encourage you guys in bed to turn to each other after you do your prayers, before you kiss goodnight. Maybe say one thing I really loved about them that day. One thing I really loved about you today. Thank you. I really love that you gave me a hug when I really needed today. I really love that today you saw that the kids were being extra rowdy and you took charge in that moment. Whatever you want it to be. Okay? There you go. Get curious versus mind reading. Has anyone heard the term mind reading before? It's hopefully straightforward, I think. Okay, if not, I'll explain it to you guys. Mind reading is something we call a cognitive distortion in the CBT world, but also another form of bias and perceiving imperfections is that we often assume we know exactly what our partner is thinking because we know them so incredibly well, right? Mind reading is the version where we think we assume, I actually know what you're thinking right now in this situation, in this action, in this response, when there's a very highly likelihood that you actually don't know what they're thinking. So couples often do this. We all do it in our everyday life. Instead of actually assuming you know what your partner is thinking or feeling, which does lead to misunderstandings almost always, actually get curious. Instead of assuming, ask, hey, can you help me understand what it is that just happened right now or what it is that you're feeling? I feel like I just saw something, you said something, whatever it might be, and I want to check in with you about what that is, rather than just assuming, oh, now she's pissed at me. Does that make sense? Curiosity is arguably the most powerful psychological tool that I've ever heard of and seen in real life, and I do encourage you guys to practice it. It's highly underrated. Use I statements when you guys are expressing these things. I want to understand this better. I feel this when this situation happens. Do not give your partner an opportunity to have to fill in the blanks for you because, as we just learned, they will go to the negative. It is a way that their mind is wired. We both and all of us do that. That makes sense? I encourage you guys to then, as a result, set up a weekly check-in conversation so that you guys can discuss these feelings, these needs, and concerns so that it doesn't feel like you're having to, again, do mind reading. The next one is accepting influence and compromise with respect. This is a tough one. What do I mean when I say accept influence? We have been charged and we've been commanded to submit to one another mutually. Accepting influence means that we graciously, humbly, staying curious and open-minded, accept influence and ideas from our partner with compromise and with respect, is also being mindful that it's also hopefully being received with respect, right? If your partner is fully critiquing you and criticizing you in that moment, yeah, it is harder to accept influence. But hopefully you guys can call that out and say, hey, I really want to hear what you just said to me, but I can't quite understand or make sense of what you just said when it's coming across as a criticism. Can you try that again? It's a very simple ask, right? But also very helpful. Listen to their point of view, even when you disagree. I want to remind you guys, it is okay to disagree with your partner. It is not okay to be disrespectful about your disagreement, okay? Compromise by saying, the compromise in this is, okay, maybe I don't agree with you, but what is important to you in this situation? How can I better understand what is the most important thing you need from me in this situation? That is the most kind and respectful thing you can do in a compromise, is honing in on what's important about it and allowing yourself to submit in that way. Okay? Within this, I want to encourage you guys, when conflict arises, try to bring it back to your shared values rather than proving who's right. This is a really tough one, especially when we start to perceive our partners as wrong or imperfect, whatever it might be. I want you guys to take a minute to take a step back and remember your shared values. Remember why you fell in love. This is a particularly, I think, also important one because this actually, again, I think the same way we talked about gratitude, brings about an emotional experience that we don't often get to engage in on a daily basis. I want you guys to encourage you, and maybe to try this tonight, is to take a trip down memory lane and remind yourself of the reasons that you did fall in love with your husband or wife in the first place. This really can help rekindle feelings of affection and appreciation. This seems like a simple solution, but this is a simple solution to what is often a big relationship killer, right? We just saw with Devil ChatGPT that one of the interrupting thoughts that can come up is, I'm going to make them seem like they no longer, I'm no longer in love with this person. I love them, but I no longer love them, right? So this is important to do in an active, meaningful moment. What I mean by that is actually taking time, not just to scroll through your thoughts like you scroll on your phone through your photos. I mean, really look at a picture that you guys have from when you were first starting to date, and look at that picture and allow your mind to take a minute to acclimate to remembering every emotion you had when you saw his or her face, every feeling you had the first time that you guys held hands, every moment that you guys had when you had maybe your first kiss, whatever it might be. Leaning into this, we know from psychological research, is that when you're able to mindfully engage in a moment like this, it actually does immediately, in that moment, will improve your perception of your marital satisfaction. So this is important because it's just a small way to start to remind you that you guys have you've fallen in love before, right? So if you've done this once, you can do it again, instead of using it as a way to start to see separation between the two of you. And this is the last one. I promise you guys I'm almost done here. This is the last one, but I'm going to say this is the most important one. I am going to offer you guys a challenge. And so self-reflection and accountability, I think, are, again, based on everything we just talked about, two of the hardest things to do in this world. It's incredibly hard, guys, to look into a mirror, and everything that I talked about, what the devil uses, the way that we are set up in this world evolutionarily, we are not wired to naturally decide, today is the day I'm going to really face my inner demons. Today is the day I'm going to take a look at myself and decide my pride is too big. This is not how we are wired. This takes mental effort and practice. This is a conscious skill and decision you have to make to engage in this kind of practice. It is not for the faint of heart. I will tell you guys that. But when you do it, when you're able to engage effectively, this, I kid you not, is quite literally life-changing. So I want to talk about the reason of this. We know that when you're able to take more accountability, just in terms of your relationship here, it will immediately reduce your conflict. How you suppose do you make that connection? Self-reflection ultimately will lead to taking responsibility. I cannot express to you guys, and maybe you guys have practiced this, which I hope you have, how many times when you have said to your partner, I see that I made a mistake and I am sorry. And I want to encourage you guys to think about if that's ever happened in your relationship and you might have been in the midst of a big blow up type fight or anything like that, what immediately happens to the conversation? Depends on the person, for sure. More often than not, though, it will de-escalate it, right? There's a moment, a pause. Maybe your spouse is taken aback by this. Yeah, were you going to say something? Exactly. It completely changes the tide of the conversation, right? It opens up the door instead of to continue to escalate in conflict. It's a moment where responsibility taking from either end opens up the door and sets the entire pathway for moving forward together, rather than maybe feeling like I'm going to stand my ground and I'm not going to back off. This is how I feel, whatever it might be. So we know this from research because self-reflection also, when you're reflecting on your own emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, and why you do what you do, you're more likely to increase empathy, hopefully for yourself, because you can give yourself grace and healing and forgiveness. But you're also then going to practice that more for your partner. The antidote for perceiving imperfections based on everything we just saw, the root of this is empathy. You cannot be mad at your partner and hate your partner and try to practice any of these skills if you're not coming from a place of empathy and understanding as to why they are feeling the way that they're feeling. And equally so, why are you feeling the way that you're feeling? So this is an important aspect of change of why this is important. It also leads to emotional growth. I do think that there, like we saw from the brain differences between men and women are a little bit more apt to this, right? We are generally, women tend to be a little bit more emotionally intelligent because that's the way that their brain, we are wired this way. However, accountability does lead to eventually emotional maturity. I cannot stress this enough for men, that this is a really important aspect that your wife does need from you at times. And equally, when I'm gonna, don't worry guys, I'm gonna address the women too, don't worry. But this is an important piece I want you guys to pay attention to. When we accept responsibility for our own emotional responses, and if you've done the work to pay attention to why I'm having this response, and hopefully holding empathy for your response, it will probably lead to you less of blaming your partner for why you're feeling the way you're feeling and being able to take that accountability. This leads to a healthier, more stable relationship. Your wife will start to see you as someone who can understand and she can trust those reactions better. This is incredibly important for a woman to feel safe in her relationship. Okay? When it comes, yeah.
You said something very important, but say it quickly.
Oh, sorry.
And when you've done the work. Yeah. What does that mean?
When you have done the work to heal and to understand the way that your internal world, those emotions, those thoughts, those sometimes these narratives that we hold on to that are doing us harm more than good, when you've done that kind of work to heal from all that, I know that's very vague. This is I'm definitely giving you a very psychological answer. But when you're done the work to heal from that, it leads to a larger pathway for all of these skills to eventually follow after. Doing the work is incredibly subjective. I use that kind of colloquially because it's hard to define. For every single person, doing the work is different. And so for some people, it's being able to understand that the way that I grew up has led me to act and feel this way in certain situations with my partner. For some other people, it's recognizing that I have an anger problem. When I get into a fight, for whatever reason it is, my explosive nature comes out, right? Whatever doing the work is for you personally, it's the idea of really sitting in self-awareness. Awareness is the first step to changing anything that we're talking about here. If you can't be aware if you're doing something that's problematic, you're never going to change it.
It's only a part of it. One of the things you said that I like, it said when you're aware of the internal patterns that don't work for you, psychologically, it's cognitive behavioral therapy, so these are like behavioral loops. But from a spiritual standpoint, and there's actually, believe it or not, overlap, the Orthodox Church has a word for them. They're called logismoi. So basically, negative thoughts or like evil thoughts. So whereas one could look at them from a CBT neurobiological background, from our church we look at them as a spiritual, metaphysical, somewhat like demonically inspired negative patterns.
Yeah, thank you for that. 100% I agree. It depends. Like I think, your perspective on things. Do I believe personally and psychologically that there's a true influence outside of yourself and an attack on your spiritual world, your internal world? Absolutely, 100%. That's why Devil ChatGPT kind of nailed it. It is kind of speaking to a truth that already exists in this world, right? He already knows what he's talking about. So I hope that answered your question, Michael, a little bit. Yeah. MCAR.
I just really appreciate that you're talking about accountability. I think because something I try to talk with premarital couples about is Most of us, when we got married, we didn't realize that part of the arrangement or the agreement or the covenant we were getting into was that I am committing to personal growth. Like, that's part of the marriage, like, quote unquote contract. Like, I'm entering this process of personal growth. And that's why we say that God uses the sacraments, including marriage, as a means by which he perfects us and reveals himself to us. So, and that's why we say, like, marriage is like a mirror, because a lot of times, you know, in our marriages, what the problem is me, you know, and if I didn't sign up or realize I was signing up for myself growing, then I'm going to just keep falling, my marriage will keep falling flat on its face all the time. Like every time something comes up, it's going to be like the other person this. But that's why Jesus said, look at the plank in your own eye before you look at the speck. And so much of like what you said about like doing the work, I think maybe one time we should just do like a talk about the top 5 to 7 like doing the works that people need to do, because there's just so many of these things that like we just kind of, it's like, because it's so hard to face. It is so humbling to realize that like I am flawed. And you know, part of it too is grieving all the lost time, because as soon as I accept that like I'll just use a simple one, a really simple one. As soon as I accept that my anxiety has been harming my relationships for the last 15 years, and now I can fix it. Now I have to grieve the fact that I lost 15 years of happy relationships that could have been much better. And so I don't even want to accept that or acknowledge that my anxiety has been screwing stuff up, and it's still screwed up, because it'll launch me into this grief process too. But that's part of doing the work. You know, it's part of doing the work. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Makar. That was such an important additive, right? I think to like take away the key points, it is so powerful, even in a thought exercise, for you guys to think about what would it be like if 2 people came together and in the mirror said, I am the problem. And they both were saying that about themselves. What kind of relationship would that open the doorway to? And secondly, the grieving aspect is really real. That could be a reason I want you guys to think about back when I was talking about attachment, is this might be a reason you may not be willing to face these parts of yourself. It will come with hurt feelings. It will come with grieving. It will come with realization that you may be a part of your very own problems. That is a lot for the ego, this very small ego that we were all given by the grace of God to deal with. It could be a lot. What is often the case is that for most of us, everything that we're talking about here, this is an effort if we're talking about self-preservation, right? We want to preserve our ego. That's evolutionarily necessary for us. It is not easy to reassure yourself to say, I will still be a whole, safe, healthy person if I acknowledge the incredible magnitude of my own weakness, of my own imperfection, which is why a lot of what I'm hoping I'm naming here is that we take the stigma off this word imperfection, and we remove the labeling of this to just hold, you are flawed. Why is that a bad thing? Why does that have to be a bad thing? Rather than feel ashamed about it or feel like I cannot face this idea that I'm not the perfect partner for my husband or whatever it might be, is to let that go. Hold forgiveness for yourself the way that we are taught to hold forgiveness from the church for any magnitude of sins. Allow yourself to walk into doing the work to be able to see yourself as a whole person, despite your past, despite your hurt, despite the pain that you might have gone through in your life.
And also there's kind of like this paradox in Christianity where like the way we talk about weakness, like there's a few verses like when Jesus told St. Paul, my strength is made perfect in weakness. And in Joel it says, let the weak say I am strong. Like there's something about like honing in and leaning into the weakness that actually like brings forth a tremendous strength when you say, the Lord is my strength. And so, but we don't want to do that because it's too vulnerable. We're too exposed. Like we just don't want to do that. We don't feel safe. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. A lot of what any of the things I put up here are around, it does require like empathy for sure, but vulnerability. It takes vulnerability to do any of these things. It takes vulnerability within yourself to stop your own mind from going down the track of, my husband didn't do this today, my wife said this today, and to stop and say, why am I allowing myself to let those thoughts be there? I'm going to be vulnerable enough to acknowledge this is my own flaw. I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to take a minute to actually practice something else. This takes time and effort, guys. This is not, and I'm tasking you guys with this because this is not easy work, but it's something that will ultimately yield to lifelong satisfaction. Lifelong, guys, right? And this is really what we all strive for. We want to be unified in a godly marriage, the way we were tasked to do. This is some of those skills to help you get there. And so the last slide I have, and this is the end of my presentation, is this is a long one, so we're not going to read it, but I want to encourage everyone to pull out their phone and take a picture of this. And I will give everyone a moment to do that. So while you guys are doing that, I want to name something to you guys I'm giving you guys homework. For the first time I've done a talk like this, I'm giving homework, but I really like giving people homework. I've learned. I'm a little bit weird like that. So I want to talk to you guys about why I'm giving this particular one. Husbands and wives, I'm speaking directly to you today as a husband and a wife sitting in front of me right now. Your role is God ordained. It has you yourself as an individual. You are uniquely gifted and you are uniquely graced for your specific union with your partner. Yeah? That's hopefully something we can all attest and we believe in. In this role, we may sometimes find it, in conclusive what we all saw, we may be swayed by a lot of the big emotions that we feel when we're in a battle of imperfection and noticing a negativity. When the devil ChatGPT has his claws in the beginning of his claws in our relationship, we are easily swayed by those big emotions. Those perceived imperfections and flaws of our partner, they can feel inescapable. And I want you guys to think about how many days sometimes does it go on where you find yourself in a pattern of negativity, negative thinking, negative emotional evaluation towards your spouse on any given day. It can go on, guys. I'm talking about it can go on for years. It can go on for months and years and years and years and years. This will lead to resentment. This will lead to dissatisfaction and disconnection in your marriage. However, I really want to encourage you guys to consider that through these powerful emotions, that there is a way out. And it's okay for you guys to be actually considering that a lot of everything we were just naming today these are lies. They're not actually the truth of what is happening. I'm not saying here that you guys should not be sometimes upset about the things that happen in your relationship. This is not me saying, yes, have no expectations, allow your partner to do everything. Of course, I'm definitely not condoning any sort of abuse or affair, anything of that nature. But what I am condoning is for you guys to take a step into the mirror and to consider that your own thoughts, they are lying to you. They are getting in the way of you feeling connected and safe and whole in the union that you have been ordained to be in with your partner. So acknowledging that these thoughts are first and foremost and probably only for self-preservation is the first step to acknowledgement. It's understanding I'm having these thoughts right now, and it is easier to have these thoughts to protect myself. It is easier for me to focus on my partner's flaws than it is to look in the mirror, and that's really hard to do. It's you just acknowledging that with yourself. Man, it's hard to sit here and make my partner the devil 24/7. Man, it's hard to sit here and hold these negative evaluations even towards myself as a result of having these kinds of thoughts. This is hard work to do. So we must acknowledge our own weakness. We must acknowledge our own imperfection. We must acknowledge that this is acceptable. Our own weakness also impacts our partner who also has weakness. This is all okay. This is not a bad thing to acknowledge. This is not a sin. We ourselves are flawed. Hopefully that's been established today, and that can be okay. And that what I hope it can be okay to talk about is if you want to see a change in your partner's flaws, you start with yourself. You make the change first and watch what happens. Women, this is directed towards you, wives, okay? We are tasked from our role uniquely from God to be the emotional supporters. We were created, like we learned in Genesis 2:18, we were created to be a helper comparable to our husbands. What does this mean practically? These questions actually, when I first wrote them, were dedicated towards just specifically the women in this room. And then I realized, and I was like, actually, it's kind of applicable to both. But the reason this is more applicable to the women is because as women, I'm telling you guys, you are tasked a little bit with leading the emotional charge. And I want to encourage you guys, rather than bemoaning this at times and feeling like, oh, I hate that I have to educate my husband on how to understand me emotionally better, think this as more of an opportunity for you to hone in on this is your own possible weakness, but it's a skill that you've been tasked with to help and support your partner, which is what we were told to do from the beginning. Yeah. I absolutely hear you on that, except for that's not true. So I hear you, but that's not entirely accurate. You are capable I want to clarify. You are capable to degree is definitely, I'm going to upload my brain development update. But there is a difference. I'm only naming that to hold with you. Forgive me. You are capable. The difference is the way women will perceive what we believe men are capable of should match our own emotional intelligence. And this is where we need to modify our expectations for sure, but be charged in feeling comfortable and confident in being very patient, but walking in and leading through your example how to have your men and the husbands in your life work to emotionally fulfill you as well by first giving it to them. This is the hardest thing to do. Yeah. Got you, fam. So I have these questions as something that I do actually want to encourage you guys in your own time. I put these up here for you guys to reflect upon this. This might be maybe your first go about with doing the work, as you'll hear a lot of psychologists say. Maybe this is you've been doing this for a long time and some of these questions will feel obvious. At bare minimum, I hope what this can be is to foster a conversation between you and your husband or wife. So some of these ones are really tough to face. A lot of these really are going to force you, hopefully, to look in the mirror, right? So for example, one of them is, are you encouraging your spouse in their God-given role, or are you constantly criticizing and comparing them to others? Ugh. Not a fun question to read, right? But I want you guys to really take a moment. Notice if you have a reaction to reading that question. I know when I first read it and I wrote it, I was like, that's not comfortable. I don't like it. I don't like feeling that I know that this is bringing up, right? And if you're anything like me, and hopefully you guys are not, is that you might feel a little bit uncomfortable. The discomfort is a good sign. When you see discomfort, walk towards it. Keep going until it's unbearable, and then take a break, and then try again. But the goal of this is to open up your heart and your mind and to walk into a space where you recognize and take responsibility that you're equally part of this place where then our marriage becomes imperfect. But rather you two together, when you're able to do this accountability exercise together and eventually walk in it with together, you guys get to see you are perfect together. You are a perfect union. The reason that God has for bringing you guys together is unknown, but know that it's there. Hopefully you guys can discover that together through these types of discussions. And that's all I got for you guys. So thank you. Oh, sorry, I will read it off. I don't know if we have readers in here. I do find that these books, if we're thinking about developing your own self-awareness or you're wanting to learn more about these topics, highly recommend these books. As you can see, the number one book I recommend is John Gottman's. It's Why Marriages Succeed or Fail. He does talk about that study he did where he can predict the divorce with a 90% success rate. He talks about the four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So if you haven't read this book, highly recommend. It's a pretty easy read. Timothy Keller, have we heard of Timothy Keller? Yeah, many of us have, I'm sure. I feel like it was recommended to everyone doing premarital counseling. So it's a good book if you haven't read The Meaning of Marriage. Really, really great book. The first one, do we all know who Brene Brown is? She's very pop psychology. She's very in right now. The reason I chose this book is because we're talking about imperfection, but also I do think she does a phenomenal job about having you sit with the idea of imperfection as not a bad thing, which is a lot of what we talked about today. And then the very last book is a little bit more. I did speak about this book a little bit when I was last time here, but it is called Creative for Connection. It's an opportunity for you guys to have conversations with each other with the understanding of God as your foundation to improve your marriage. Really great book. Highly recommend it. And so if anyone will let me take pictures. Yeah. And then I have a ton of a ton of resources if you guys need it. And that's my contact. Okay, now I'm done. I'm done for real. Okay. Thank you guys. Do we have any questions, or we have time for questions, or we're done? Yeah. Okay.
What is question?
Questions or comments or feedback?
All right. So back to the doing the work.
Hi, Michael.
So it sounds like from what you described, doing the work, a lot of it, it's going to be hard to do on your own. I don't know if you were like trying to advertise therapy.
Should I?
No, like it just felt like when you were talking about it, like this is going to be really hard for me to do on my own. And what you mentioned earlier is that when I look at my own imperfections, I have a tendency to neglect them or avoid them. So if I do that whole exercise and I look at all my imperfections, I'm just going to be like, yeah, not important, not important, not important, move on. Well, that's not doing the work. That's just careless and negligent at best. So do we all need therapists?
Michael, I love everything you just said. That's a great question. I first want to acknowledge, like, I appreciate you being really transparent, and forward with you understanding your own thought process. It sounds like you're kind of already on the way to doing some of the work. So kudos to you. That's actually amazing. It's important that you recognize, like, to answer your question, no, not everyone needs therapy. I'm saying that as a psychologist who actively wants business 24/7. So that should tell you something. No, not everyone needs therapy. Do I recommend it? Absolutely. More than anything else, anything can be therapy in the right context. There is no substitution for clinical therapy. That is its own reserved right. I will stand by that. But anything can be therapy. The point of therapy ultimately is to have an open space, a space that is safe, that you can walk into that space, accept and own your vulnerabilities, and know that you can walk out of it. And that's a really hard thing to do on your own for sure. So is therapy helpful for that? That's one avenue. Yes. Can you do this and have these conversations with your spouse? Yes. Should you also be able together recognize when it's getting to a point where some of the complexities of your vulnerabilities, some of the things from your past are coming up, difficult conversations where maybe you don't know how to respond to your partner is happening. And at that point, maybe you guys decide together, we need therapy, or you or I need therapy individually. Yes. Know when to ask for help. I think I've said that in like every talk I've given is know when to ask for help. This should not, it's 2025, guys. We should not be no longer afraid to talk about therapy and seeking therapy. I hope that's not a stigma. But if it is, come talk to me. I'm happy to sit down with you and we can explore that stigma together. There's no shame in doing that if that's what you feel. Can you talk to a really trusted friend about this and do this with them? Sure. Can you do this on your own? Absolutely. Does it take an incredible amount of skill and self-discipline? Yes. You will have to stick at it even when it's hard. And you will have to tell yourself, I know I didn't like that and I was uncomfortable. I'm going to give myself a day and I will come back to this. And you have to hold yourself accountable to that. Yeah. I'm so sorry. I can't hear. I'm deaf.
Does realization of a weakness automatically lead to healing? So you know you have a problem. And you talk about it, sometimes it feels, and in therapy, even almost endlessly. But does that mean just by talking about it, you heal it?
That's another great question. No, it doesn't, right? It's one thing, you can, I don't have a good reference for this. Oh, sorry. My references are done for the day. No, it is. No, I will. There's one, seeing something and observing it and calling it for what it is a fact. Like, this is my weakness. That's you just naming a fact, right? Nothing goes beyond that. What takes that moment from recognizing a fact into change is that you start to connect in real-time awareness, this moment where I see this fact is happening right now. When you're slowing down that process and watching, there's a dual part of your brain that's doing this. You're watching yourself acknowledge the fact in real time. Thank you, Makar. Spectating. That was the word I was looking for. Spectating. When you're able to spectate your own process, there's a split-second decision where you get to make a choice. And that choice is what leads to change, right? It's that moment where you recognize the weakness and you've spectated enough and you've slowed down enough where you can make a change. What was that? When you see the pattern. Yes, of course. So that's why I'm saying this takes time, right? It takes time to see a pattern overall. And I want to really hone in on not setting an expectation for how much time this should take you guys to do this exercise or anything like that. Everyone is incredibly unique, right? I've seen people in therapy for 6 months who figured this out. They figured out what their issue is and they go right through it in 6 months. That's something that you can do. I've also seen people in therapy for now 5 or 6 years. It takes a little bit more time. Your brain is unique. God gave you the beautiful brain that you have. Do not question it. Do not judge it. Take your time. When you get there, you will have arrived. And I know that sounds strange, but you'll know. You'll know when you're there.
I'll say this quickly because I know there's a question back there too, and we're over time. Just back to Kiko's question. So I think one, we should all acknowledge when our personal growth or doing the work is happening inefficiently, because that's where I think more experienced help can really benefit, because they know how to map out the heart, the mind, the relationships, the patterns. Like they know which questions to go for. It's like there's a lot of low hanging fruit in this stuff. Like if you're in it, you already. By the way, if you're doing the work, if you're a professional, first of all, you were required to do therapy yourself. So you had to do the work yourself a lot of times. And then you kind of already know like the first 10 questions to ask, to explore, like tell me about your parents, tell me about your siblings, tell me about a traumatic event, and how to drill into each one, and then how to connect it back up and out. So it's a lot more efficient than, just like reading books and listening to lectures. And also those things are not usually never, ever, ever, ever personalized and customized for you. So that's where there's an efficiency benefit. One question that a lot of us get stuck on, I think, is, well, why didn't the generations before us have to do therapy as much? Why wasn't this coming up, with the church fathers and the priests who guided me when I was younger and all this stuff? And this is a very long discussion, but I think in general, as humans over many generations advance, we have innovation in so many areas, including in our emotions. So, and also I think the emotional demands on us now are significantly greater than in generations past. So there's a demand for a lot greater emotional sophistication now. When my grandfather would come home and all he had to work on was feeding 12, 13, 14 kids, and that's what he had to do. And my grandmother was sick, and she was taking care of all these kids. And I wasn't going to tell my grandfather to ask my grandmother about her emotions. They were just trying to eat, But now eating is not even a question. Roof over our head, not a question. We have all this time. So there's a lot more emotional demands on us nowadays, which is why we also need more emotional resources. Yeah. There's a question back there, by the way.
Yeah, thank you, Makar. That was just to kind of touch on that point. Exactly. I want you guys to note something about the brain structure slide that I did earlier was there are parts of that brain that actually have, over time, very slowly, upon decades of research, we've seen slightly evolve. But the parts of the brain that really are responding to the emotional connection, the emotional needs, they've grown bigger, but the size of it hasn't changed. There's certain parts of the brain, like the amygdala, which is the part that we talk about is the stress response, responsible for your fight or flight. That has not changed in size at all in the last 300, 400 years or so. There's a reason for that. The emotional complexity processing of our brain, the hippocampus combined with the amygdala, that there's a part in between. That part actually has gotten bigger in size for exactly the same reason Makara was talking about. We now equate survival, and part of the survival needs we have, emotional connection and social connection is now a survival need. We would die without one another. That is so evident. So I want that to be something you guys understand. We need one another, support one another, open up those doors to help one another. Yeah, sorry about the question.
I didn't really have a question. Oh, you didn't? No, I was gonna just add to something, but it's okay. It's fine. No, please add it. Well, to what Makar was saying, it could also have something to do with more focus on ourselves. We are just really more self-centered these days, and so just less emphasis on others. Someone had said something to me recently about back then, like there weren't mirrors for the longest time, right? So we weren't intended to see our faces as often as we see them now. So just this big emphasis on us and our needs and being happy and just that movement. The other thing I was going to say is about doing the work. It's just I think it's just a lifelong journey as well. And so and part of growing. And so I feel like as you're doing the work, God also does reveal to you that what's missing, or something that clicks. You read something, you're like, wait a second, that is me. I am like this. So then you realize that people have studied that, and then you find a book related to it, and then they ask these really great questions, and you really are honing in that moment about that specific thing you're going through. So I think therapy is such a great entry point, and even sometimes along the journey, if you get stuck along the way with one of those things that is revealed to you, it's such a great way to kind of keep going and asking more questions. But I think that it just never ends.
Love that.
I'm going to add to what Nancy said real quick. I definitely agree. And I think the more we understand our own attachment styles, the more it helps us self-reflect. So like, I'll speak for myself, like over the last course of the year, as we've done therapy, like I've learned that I'm completely avoidant. Like I sweep things under the rug. I wake up the next morning and I want everything, like everything is going to be fine and dandy the next day. I just will go to sleep and then reset tomorrow. And tomorrow I'll forget everything that kind of happened in the past, and we're going to have we're going to start fresh again. And so you tend to realize that you don't want to face issues or confrontations or problems, and you just kind of want them to kind of just magically go away. And so for myself, like when we were doing, weekly therapy and like we're having our own individual sessions, it was really tough for me in the beginning to like address questions, because for me it's like uncomfortable, or it's very like self-reflective and I have to dig deep, and I'm like, I haven't really thought about that. Like I haven't really soaked it in and really thought about these kind of self-reflection questions. So having someone there kind of guiding that conversation, if you don't have the time to do all the reading and the own self-reflection, just having it be like a mirror and having someone that you can like just talk to for an hour a week and kind of just share that conversation with, and they kind of ask you those personal questions where you're like, I really have to think about that and I'll get to you next week. It really has helped over the course of the year to kind of realize yourself better, understand how that attachment style works with your spouse, and you really see a lot of benefits. So.
That's a question to ask, right? Is when we see those differences of like, that's so curious that God put us together. That's probably exactly for that reason, so that you both can learn from each other in your own different ways, how to support one another better. It is funny the way God definitely got a sense of humor. I know he's pretty much laughing at us all the time up there. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I'm always going to plug therapy, guys. If you guys have questions about it, I'm happy to even talk very like transparently with you as a therapist and as a human that's not a therapist 24/7. So I'm happy to answer those questions you guys have. And yes, come talk to me anytime about anything. Sorry. Thank you, guys.
In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and God, amen. Thank you, dear Lord Jesus, our God, for this time together, for our place together with you in our midst. Thank you for Angie and Mina and for blessing them as a couple. Thank you for Angie's service to us, and thank you for all of our marriages and our journeys, Lord. You know each of them, and you are with us in each of them. Bless our spouses, bless our personal growth journeys, bless our spouses' growth, bless our children and their development and their growth in your fear and love. Please, God, be with this church and all the services, and bless this Lenten season, and let it be a period of change and repentance for all of us through the intercessions of Saint Mary and the prayers of all your saints. Make us worthy to pray thankfully, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. In Christ Jesus our Lord finds the kingdom, power, and the glory forever. Amen.